I opened my home to Briella with all my sincerity, but my daughter-in-law gave me back a bland beige dress and a declaration to sell my family legacy for a trip to Bali. Why is a mother's love placed on such a cheap scale of material things? Hello, my sisters and my friends from afar. I am Madison. Florida is a bit muggy today, a heat that reminds me of those days we spent getting through that harsh respiratory season when loneliness seemed to be our only friend. Thank you for stopping by my little corner. If you are also looking for peace after family storms, please give me a like or leave a greeting in the comments below so we know we are never alone. Today I want to tell you about the day my world collapsed, but also the day I found the strength to stand up. I stood there in that bright Miami hotel ballroom surrounded by those expensive flowers, but my heart felt as cold as if I had just fallen through a hole in the ice. This bland beige dress Briella picked out for me, the one she claimed was appropriate for my age, felt tighter with every breath I tried to take. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see the sympathetic looks from my sisters in the church, and it made my stomach churn. My hands were shaking as I gripped that velvet box holding my late husband's vintage Omega watch, which was a treasure I had looked after for over 30 years. When I walked up onto that stage, Briella's smile did not have a bit of warmth in it because it was sharp and full of calculation. I thought this was the moment I was passing on love and a family legacy. But the way my son Russell just looked away with such indifference made my heart sink. Thank you, Mama. Briella's voice boomed through the microphone, sounding so sharp and loud. She did not take that watch like it was a piece of our history, but held it like a piece of merchandise she was ready to unload. This watch is going to be our ticket for a wonderful honeymoon in Bali, she said. And then she had the nerve to say that the best memories are the ones we create together. A few people let out some awkward laughs, and suddenly the world around me started to blur. That pain was not just in my heart, but it spread through my whole body like a physical trauma. That watch was more than metal and gears because it was his sweat and his love and the legacy he left for our family. Looking at Briella's smug face and my son's weak silence, I realized I had truly become invisible to them. This betrayal was not just about her words, because it was a knife cutting through every illusion of respect I thought I had earned. I took a step back and felt the humiliation burning my skin like the Florida sun. The room started getting loud again with the music, but inside me there was only a dead silence. I did not look at Russell one more time. I pushed through the crowd, and my Skechers shoes, which were usually so comfortable, felt as heavy as lead. I walked straight out to the balcony where the Florida sea breeze was blowing in, and it was cold, but it was enough to wake me up. I needed to remember, and I needed to look back and see exactly where I lost myself. How could an antique appraiser like me misjudge the value of a person so badly? That night, I sat by myself in the dark living room, and even the cool air from the air conditioner could not touch the deep chill inside my heart. I started going through my old notebook where I keep track of every dime I spent over the last 3 years. I remembered exactly when I pulled $40,000 out of my retirement fund to help Russell pay off those debts from back during the pandemic when his work just stopped. I gave that money without a second thought because I truly believed I was investing in my son's happiness and his future. But looking at those pages now in the quiet, I finally saw the bitter truth. Because Briella only ever reached out when the light bill was too high, or when she had her eye on a new sofa from Pottery Barn. All that love and sacrifice I had been nurturing turned out to be nothing more than a set of numbers on her balance sheet. The more I sat there thinking, the clearer it became that I had been trapped in a pattern I never even saw coming. I remembered how Briella talked Russell into selling my old car by saying it was for my safety as an older woman, and then they took that money to upgrade their own sports car. She used her fake concern to take away my legs and make me dependent on them in the very house I built with my own hands. All those times, she laughed when I struggled with some new app on my tablet, or how she would go and put my blood pressure medicine on the highest shelf where I could not reach it were not accidents. It was a systematic plan to turn a sharp antique appraiser into a confused and useless old woman in the eyes of the world. My sadness started to harden into a cold current of determination, and I realized it was finally time to stop being the victim in their play. When that first bit of Florida sunshine started peeking through the blinds, I finally closed my notebook. That numbness from the night before was gone, and in its place was a strange kind of clarity, like when I find a hidden gem under years of dust on an old piece of furniture. I was done crying. I got up and brewed myself a strong cup of black coffee and just looked out at my little garden that I had let go for far too long. A new day was starting, and this time, it was not going to belong to Briella, and it was not going to belong to Russell because it belonged to Madison Mack. This morning, I did not rush to fix breakfast for Russell and Briella like I usually do. Instead, I stepped into my comfortable Skechers shoes and felt that perfect arch support I had forgotten I deserved. I took a walk to the park near my house and breathed in that salty Florida sea air. Afterward, I stopped by Target not to buy toys or clothes for anyone else, but to pick out a soft silk pajama set and a new Kindle Paperwhite for myself. I wanted to get back into my books about antique history with the font turned up nice and large, so I would not have to squint under dim lights anymore. In the afternoon, I picked up the phone and called Sarah, who is a dear friend from my church days. I had not reached out to her in 6 months because Briella always made me feel like I was being a bother. Hearing Sarah's voice felt like 1,000 pounds was lifted off my shoulders. We met up at our favorite cafe where we could laugh out loud and talk about our lives without anyone judging us for being old-fashioned. I realized then that even with inflation making everything so expensive, and those confusing Medicare changes in 2025, my own value has not gone down one bit. That first sense of peace after so much storm finally came back to me, and it felt gentle and whole. When Sarah and I said our goodbyes, she squeezed my hand and told me I looked so much stronger. I just smiled and thanked my old friend as I walked back home with a completely different mindset. I know this quiet is just the beginning of a confrontation that is bound to happen once Briella realizes I am cutting off her access to my money. But I am not afraid anymore. I have prepared myself, and most importantly, I have found my own voice again. My dear sisters, have you ever felt like you were living so much for others that you forgot to buy yourself a comfortable pair of shoes or make time for an old friend? If you are starting your own journey to find yourself just like I am, please leave a comment saying, "Peace below," so we can encourage one another. I wish you a restful day, no matter what the weather is like. A few days after that wedding, the phone rang, and I saw Briella's name on the screen. Usually she sounded so sharp and distant, but today her voice was sweet as honey. It was that kind of sweetness that I knew was just a thin layer of sugar over a bitter trap. She started talking about how she and Russell had just been looking at some new kitchen cabinets at Home Depot and how beautiful they were. Then she mentioned how inflation has been so high lately and they were just a little short on the funds to finish the project. I was sitting right there in my favorite lazy boy recliner holding a thank you card from my church sisters. In the past, I would have felt that old familiar pull of guilt or confusion, but this time was different. I just stayed quiet and let the silence stretch out across the line until I could hear her start to clear her throat in a nervous way. I realized right then that my real power did not come from arguing, but from knowing when to hold my peace. She began to ramble on about how she only wanted to create the perfect home for the whole family, and how she was so worried about my health if I had to keep looking at that old dingy kitchen. That was always her way of using my own feelings against me by planting seeds of insecurity about the very home I had taken care of for decades. I looked out my window and noticed a bright red cardinal perched on the branch of the old oak tree in my yard. Briella, I said, interrupting her in a way that was polite, but as cold as an Atlantic breeze. I have made the decision to close that joint checking account. I need to make sure I am saving every bit I can for these upcoming Medicare changes and my own future health needs. The other end of the line went completely dead as I imagined the look of shock on her face. That honeyed sweetness in her voice disappeared faster than a Florida sunset. It was replaced by a long, heavy sigh, like she was the one being mistreated. "Mama, you have been acting so strange lately, and I really have to wonder if you have been listening to people who do not have your best interests at heart," she said. Then she took it a step further and started questioning my mental state, just like she always did when I stood up for myself. But I have spent decades as an antique appraiser, and I know how to tell the difference between a real flaw and something that has been faked to lower the value. I told her that I was perfectly fine, and that I was simply learning how to put my own needs first for once. My voice sounded as steady as a rock, and I could feel my own strength growing with every word I spoke. To try and put even more pressure on me, she brought up Russell and used him like a human shield. She told me that Russell was going to be so heartbroken because he always thought I was the one person who would truly support their dreams. I felt a little sting in my heart at the mention of my son, but I had my defenses ready this time. I told her that Russell is a grown man, and it is time for him to understand the true value of standing on his own 2 feet. I told her I had things I needed to get done, and I said goodbye before she could even get another word out. Hanging up that phone felt like a victory I had been waiting years to achieve. I set the phone down and felt a rush of confidence like a warm current running right down my spine. I knew this was just the beginning of the storm, though. Briella is not the type to just walk away when she thinks she has a claim to my life and my money. Now that I have cut off the financial supply, I know she is going to try and attack me even more directly. I looked at the new security camera app on my phone and saw that everything was quiet for now. I am standing my ground and waiting for whatever comes next. But I am not that same invisible woman I was at the wedding. The front door burst open without a single knock, and Briella marched into my home using that spare key I had not managed to get back from her yet. She did not come alone, because Russell was trailing behind her like a shadow with his head down and his eyes refusing to meet mine. "Mama, why on earth did you cancel my credit card?" Briella screamed as she slammed her expensive designer handbag down on my kitchen table. The air in the room suddenly felt thick and heavy, just like it did in New Orleans right before Hurricane Katrina made landfall years ago. I was standing behind my kitchen island, and I had to grip the edge of the granite counter so hard my knuckles turned white, just to keep myself from shaking or falling over in the face of her pure aggression. I took a deep breath and told her that account was in my name, and I have every right to manage my own finances however I see fit. Briella let out a mean and nasty laugh that sent a cold shiver right down my spine. "You manage things," she mocked while looking at me with total contempt. Then she asked me with a sneer if I even remembered where I left my reading glasses this morning. She told me I was destroying my own son's future and throwing away his happiness just because of my own selfish old age. She kept stepping closer and closer until she was invading my personal space, and it felt like she was trying to use her height to suffocate my spirit, which was a kind of emotional terrorism she had clearly been practicing for a long time. I looked over at Russell, hoping and praying for a single word of support, but my son just kept staring down at the floor. He was focused on his New Balance sneakers, like they were the most interesting thing in the world, while his mother was being attacked in her own kitchen. I asked him if he was really going to just stand there and stay silent while this woman insulted and shamed me in my own home. My voice cracked because the pain of his silence was almost worse than her shouting. Briella snapped at me to leave Russell out of it and told me that I knew perfectly well that everything I owned was going to be theirs sooner or later anyway. She told me I was basically just a caretaker holding on to their inheritance for them. It felt like a bucket of ice water had been thrown in my face, and I finally saw the naked greed in her eyes for exactly what it was. That was the moment something inside of me finally snapped after years of being pushed into a corner. I have spent my entire professional life appraising the true value of old and forgotten things, and I looked her dead in the eye and told her I had completely misjudged her value from the very start. I yelled for her to stop, and the power in my own voice actually made them both jump back in surprise. I told her she had absolutely no right to this house, or to a single penny of the money I had worked my fingers to the bone to earn while she was busy spending it. I started listing off every single sacrifice I had made, including the $40,000 I took from my own retirement fund to pay off their debts when the world shut down. I told them that all I had ever received in return was her disrespect and his spinelessness. Briella did not back down or show a bit of remorse because she just moved on to making direct threats against my life. She asked me how I thought a lonely and frail old woman like me was ever going to survive in this world without them around to look after me. She told me I was going to deeply regret treating my future daughter-in-law this way when I ended up sick and alone. She even went so far as to hint that I was not mentally sharp enough to be living on my own anymore, which was a clear threat to my freedom and my independence. She was trying to make me feel small and incapable, but her words only served to make my heart harder and my resolve stronger. I raised my hand and pointed it straight toward the front door, and I told them both to get out of my house that very second. I told her to leave that key on the table, or I would be calling the local police and my elder law attorney before they even made it to their car. Briella made a face and huffed like she was the one being victimized, and then she grabbed her keys and threw them onto the floor. The cold and sharp sound of that metal hitting the tile felt like the final snap of the bond between us. As they walked out the door, she turned back one last time and gave me a look of such pure hatred that I knew this was just the beginning of the dirty tricks she was planning to use against me. I slammed the door shut and turned the deadbolt, and then I just collapsed into the nearest chair. My whole body was shaking from the adrenaline and the exhaustion of the fight, but inside my chest, I felt a sense of resilience that I had never known in all my 70 years. I had faced down the storm, and I was still standing on my own 2 feet in my own home. I took a deep and steady breath and let the familiar scent of the sandalwood incense in my living room start to settle my nerves and bring me back to myself. I knew this battle was far from over, and I understood that I needed to start building a fortress around my life to keep people like that out for good. As the quiet finally returned to the house, I refused to let myself sit in the sadness for more than a minute. I stood up and grabbed my notebook and a pen, and I started making a methodical list of exactly what needed to happen next to protect myself. I knew I had to change every single lock on every door and window, and I needed to get in touch with Mr. Miller, who is the best attorney in town for senior rights. I had been a victim for the last time, and I was going to make sure that no one ever had the chance to make me feel invisible or worthless again. The very next day, I woke up with a sense of purpose that I had not felt in years, and I started the morning by changing the hardware of my life. I called a local locksmith and had him replace every single lock on my doors and windows with the kind of high-tech digital keypads that only I could access with a code. As I watched him work, I also set up a new ring security camera system all around the perimeter of my property, which allowed me to keep a watchful eye on everything right from the screen of my Kindle. Every time I heard that solid mechanical click of a new lock sliding into place, it felt like a bold affirmation that I was finally the true master of my own home again. For the first time in months, I did not find myself jumping at every little noise outside the door, or living in constant fear that someone was going to use a stolen spare key to barge into my sanctuary. Once the house was secure, I moved on to reinforcing the software of my life, which was my financial independence. I took a trip down to the bank and sat with a manager to open a completely new set of accounts that were solely in my name. I went ahead and moved every single penny from the joint account that Briella used to have access to, and I made sure to set up the most rigorous security alerts and two-factor authentication possible. Looking at the numbers in my savings passbook, I made a silent promise to myself that I would protect this nest egg with everything I had. I knew I had to be careful so that I would never become a burden on the state or have to suffer through that kind of financial abuse ever again. I spent the better part of the afternoon sitting in the office of Attorney Miller, who is a sharp and powerful African-American woman with a real heart for the struggles people our age face. There was something so comforting about sitting in her office and knowing she truly understood the cultural weight of what I was going through. I handed her the detailed log I had been keeping of every single time Briella tried to manipulate me or use my own feelings against me. We spent hours going over the paperwork to officially revoke the power of attorney I had foolishly given away, and we started the process of updating my will to reflect my new reality. Miss Miller reached across the desk and took my hand, and she told me I was doing the right thing. She reminded me that I should never let my natural kindness be turned into a weapon to be used against my own well-being. On my way back home, I made a quick stop at the UPS store to mail off a very important package. Inside were certified copies of all those strange and unauthorized charges I had discovered on my credit card statements, which I sent directly to the Fraud Investigation Department. I actually felt like a real investigator in one of those crime shows, as I systematically began to pull apart the web of deceit Briella had been spinning around me for so long. Every envelope I sealed and every document I filed felt like I was taking another giant step toward a life of justice and fairness. I also took a step that was painful, but absolutely necessary by cutting off all of our digital ties. I pulled out my phone, and I blocked Briella's number, and I went through my social media to limit my presence, so she could no longer track my every move or see who I was spending my time with. I realized I needed a completely quiet space to heal my spirit without having to deal with her toxic messages or those guilt-tripping comments she was so good at making. Suddenly, the digital world felt just as peaceful as my home, and the constant buzzing of my phone finally stopped. That evening, I sat in my study surrounded by all the beautiful antiques I have spent my whole life appraising and cherishing. As I looked at a rare porcelain vase, I realized that I am also a priceless antique that deserves to be preserved and handled with the utmost respect. I understood then that my true safety did not just come from the new locks on the doors or the balance in my bank account, but from the deep realization that I have the power and the right to protect myself. I decided to treat myself to a real home-cooked Southern dinner with all my favorites like slow-cooked collard greens and warm cornbread, and I could literally taste the freedom in every bite. That old heavy fear had finally started to melt away and was being replaced by a sharp and steady focus. I felt ready for whatever the next phase of this journey would bring, because I knew I was no longer fighting this battle alone. I had finally become my own strongest ally and my own best protector. But life has a way of giving us the most beautiful surprises right when we find the courage to stand up for ourselves. just as I was settling into the idea that I would be fighting this fight completely on my own. I felt a connection to my past return in a way I never expected. I heard a very soft and polite knock on my front door, and I knew immediately it was not an enemy. It was a neighbor who had been watching over me from a distance, and she was finally stepping forward to offer her hand. Mrs. Harris, who has been my neighbor for 10 years, came to my door holding a warm tray of cornbread. She told me she had heard the shouting from the day before, and her eyes were just full of genuine concern for me. For the first time in a long time, I let my guard down and told her everything about what happened at the wedding and how Briella had been manipulating my life and my relationship with Russell. Mrs. Harris took my hand, and I could see her own hands shaking a bit as she told me that I am definitely not alone in this fight. She admitted that she had actually seen Briella snooping around my mailbox more than a few times when I was not looking. She told me right then and there that she was more than willing to stand as a witness for me if I ever needed her to. Right while we were sitting there, my phone buzzed with a message from Sarah, who is an old friend of mine from the church. Sarah told me she had been looking through some old photos and notes, and she found clear evidence that Briella had been taking my car out without my permission back when I was too sick to drive. She said she was going to send those records directly to my lawyer immediately. All these pieces of support from my community started coming together, and I felt a warm surge of strength that finally pushed away the cold feeling of being betrayed. I realized that once you finally step out of the shadows of just taking what people give you, the light of real friendship will always find a way to reach you. I understood then that my safety net was not just made of legal papers and new locks, but was woven together by the sincere hearts of the people around me. Mrs. Harris and Sarah are the proof that kindness and integrity are still very much alive in this world. We even started making plans for a group of us sisters from the church to meet up at Target this weekend so we can do a little shopping and support each other. I am no longer that frail old woman they try to isolate and keep in the dark, because I am part of a strong and resilient community. Having that support gave me the courage to take an even bigger step in protecting my home. While I was cleaning out the spare room where Briella used to stay, I accidentally stumbled upon something she thought she had hidden away forever. It was a secret folder full of documents that could completely change the direction of this entire legal battle. My dear sisters, in these hard times, sometimes a simple visit from a neighbor or a text from an old friend is the best medicine for a hurting heart. Have you ever had someone step up to help you when you least expected it and made you feel like you were not alone anymore? Please leave a comment saying, "Together below," so we can keep spreading that love and support to one another. I hope you all have a beautiful day, no matter what is going on around you. I was tidying up the room Briella had occupied during her short stay, a habit of mine to keep things as orderly as the rare pieces I spent my life appraising. That is when I saw it. An old manila folder wedged deep behind the mahogany bookshelf. My professional eyes caught the discrepancy immediately because it looked out of place in such a clean room. This was not some simple decor invoice from Target or a furniture catalog. Inside were printed email chains and handwritten notes Briella had exchanged with a local real estate broker. She had been quietly getting my home appraised months ago, even before Russell had officially asked for her hand in marriage. Every word on those pages felt like a cold blade cutting through the last bit of faith I had left in her. I could feel my heart racing as I realized how long this deception had been brewing right under my nose. I read every single line, and a wave of pure disgust washed over me, making my stomach turn as I stood there in the quiet of that room. Briella had mapped it all out with a cruelty that left me breathless. Her plan was to convince Russell that I was suffering from significant memory loss right after the honeymoon. She wanted to use that lie to gain full control of my finances and move me into a low-budget nursing home far away from my neighbors and my church. She had even made a detailed inventory of the antiques in my living room, the heirlooms my husband and I spent 30 years collecting together, piece by piece. She planned to auction off my life's work just to fund her own lifestyle and travels. Any dream I had of a peaceful family was gone, replaced by a clarity so sharp it was brutal. My hands were trembling as the weight of it all hit me, but my mind had never been more focused than it was in that moment. I grabbed my new Kindle Paperwhite and used the camera function to carefully record every single page of her betrayal. I knew I had to stay calm and methodical so I would not miss a single detail. This was the strength Attorney Miller had talked about, the undeniable proof of her predatory intent and the way she planned to take advantage of me. I immediately uploaded the images to the secure portal at the law office, feeling as though I had just successfully found the key to my own liberation. The blue light from the tablet felt like a small beacon in the darkening room as I finished my work. The truth was finally standing in the light, and it was hideous to behold. This was not just about the money she wanted to steal. It was about the total violation of a sacred trust between people. I looked over at the photograph on the side table showing Russell smiling so brightly next to her, and my heart just ached with a deep, heavy sorrow. I wondered if my son knew about these plans, or if he was just another piece on the board for a woman this ambitious and hollow. I sat back in my lazy boy recliner and forced myself to take slow, deep breaths to steady my spirit. I could not allow myself to break down now because I was the only one who could save my future. The light of the truth had been revealed, and I was going to use it to find my way toward a peaceful life. As the shadows of the Florida evening began to stretch across the hardwood floors, I felt a bone-deep mental exhaustion from the discovery. I needed an anchor, an old source of strength to remind me why I was standing my ground so firmly. I walked slowly to the small wooden box on the mantel that holds my late husband's mementos. I needed to hear his steady voice in the quiet of my mind, knowing that I was doing right by the legacy and the honor of the family we built together. I sat quietly in my study, my fingers tracing the worn gold of my late husband's wedding ring as the silence of the room wrapped around me. In that stillness, I could almost see him sitting across from me, just like he used to, when he would patiently show me how to tell a real piece of pottery from 1,000 cheap fakes. Madison, he would say with that steady voice. I can still hear in my mind, the real value is always in the core character of a piece, not in the shiny gloss someone puts on the outside to hide the cracks. He spent his entire life protecting what was true and honest. And I realized it was now my turn to protect the legacy and the honor of everything we had built together over those 30 years. That deep pain of losing him so long ago was still there. But in that moment, it stopped making me feel weak and instead became a warm fire of determination burning in my heart. I remembered the years we spent leaning on each other through the hardest times, from those massive hurricanes that tore through Florida to the times we had to tighten our belts just to make sure Russell had everything he needed for school. My husband always tried to teach our son the importance of personal integrity and being a man of his word, but it felt like the flashy glitz Briella brought into his life had blinded him to those core lessons. I whispered into the quiet air as if I were having a real conversation with him, telling him about the disrespect at the wedding and the cold plans that woman had made to take away my home. In that moment, I felt his love wrapping around me like a warm blanket, providing a strange kind of peace right in the middle of this storm. I understood then that I was not just fighting for my own comfort or my bank account, but for the dignity he had left behind for our family. That heavy sadness was slowly replaced by a quiet steadfastness as I stood up and wiped away my very last tear. The memory of our love and the life we shared was like a fortress that no dirty trick or greedy scheme could ever hope to break through. I could feel the strength of my ancestors and all the resilient African American women in my family who had faced their own trials and come out on top through faith and grit. I knew exactly what I had to do now to take control of my life again. I was going to stand my ground not just for my own sake, but for Russell too, because I was still hoping that one day he might finally see the truth and return to being the man his father was so proud of. A sense of complete peace settled over me, and I felt ready to face whatever cruel move Briella was going to try next. But that peaceful moment did not last nearly long enough, because I was about to face the most thuggish and cruel attack I could have ever imagined. Once Briella realized her financial manipulation was failing, she decided to go after the most precious thing I had left, which was my freedom and my own sanity. The loud and aggressive knocking on my front door the very next morning was not the sound of a friend coming to visit. It was a government official who had been sent to check on my life and my mental state because someone had reported that I was no longer capable of taking care of myself. A middle-aged woman with a sharp badge from Adult Protective Services stood on my front porch holding a thick manila folder that looked heavy with accusations. "Mrs. Mack, we have received a formal report expressing deep concern regarding your ability to care for yourself and your current mental state," she said in a voice that was professionally cold and detached. My heart started hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and a wave of pure insult washed through my chest, making my skin feel hot. I looked past her shoulder and saw Russell's car parked down at the corner of the street, and I knew exactly whose hand was pulling the strings on this. Briella was trying to slap a label on me like I was just some confused and senile old woman, just so she could justify taking over my house and my bank accounts through the court system. It was the lowest and most cowardly move she could have made, but I refused to let her see me crumble. I took a long and steady breath, drawing on the same quiet composure I had used during thousands of high-stakes antique auctions over the decades. I told her to come right on in and that I had actually been expecting a visit like this. My voice was as firm and clear as a bell in the morning air as I led her into my living room where every single thing was in its proper place and the house smelled of fresh lemon polish. The very first thing I did was pick up my phone and call Attorney Miller, putting her right on the speakerphone so she could hear every word. Having my lawyer's strong and steady presence in the room, even if it was just through the phone, changed the entire energy of the situation. I was no longer just an elderly woman being interrogated in her own home, because I was now a citizen with full legal preparation and my own witnesses. The social worker opened her folder and started asking me a long list of questions about how I manage my daily medications, my financial decisions, and the events of the last few weeks. I answered her with total precision, making sure to use the correct names for everything I take. I explained how I take my calcium and vitamin D every single morning to keep my bones strong, and I even pulled out my neatly organized medication log. I showed her where I had started keeping track of everything the very day after I noticed Briella had been messing with my medicine cabinet to try and make me look disorganized. I handed her my Kindle Paperwhite and showed her how I keep the font size large so I can stay up to date on the daily news and continue my research into antique history. I wanted her to see that I was not just surviving, but that I was actively engaged with the world around me. The tension in the room reached a breaking point when the social worker mentioned that someone had reported I was frequently confused and was in desperate need of a legal guardian to handle my affairs. I just gave her a small and knowing smile as I reached into my desk and pulled out the printed photographs of all those strange charges on my credit card that Briella had made without my knowledge. I told her very clearly that I was not confused at all, and that I was simply being subjected to financial and emotional abuse by the very person who had filed that false report. I sat there with my back straight and explained the entire scheme to steal my home and what really happened at that wedding. I watched as the social worker started taking much more careful notes, and I could see the look in her eyes shift from cold suspicion to a deep kind of empathy. It turned out that Briella had even gone so far as to try and set up a mental health evaluation with a doctor she knew personally, but I followed Attorney Miller's advice to the letter. I politely informed the social worker that I was refusing that specific appointment, and instead I requested an independent evaluation through a reputable hospital within my own Medicare network. I looked her in the eye and told her that I am a woman of sound mind who has every right to make her own decisions about where I live and how I spend the money I earned. My resilience and my clear-headedness were so obvious that the social worker eventually had to admit there was absolutely no evidence that I lacked the capacity to care for myself. She seemed almost embarrassed that she had been sent there on such a hollow and malicious errand. Before she got up to leave, the social worker took a good long look around my home and told me that I was honestly one of the sharpest and most put-together people she had ever met at my age. I felt a huge surge of relief wash over me, but underneath it was a slow burning anger at the filthiness of Briella's tactics. She had tried to turn the very system meant to protect seniors into a trap to imprison me, but my own preparation and my refusal to be silent had saved me. I stood by the front window and watched as the social worker walked out to the street and had a very stern conversation with Russell at his car. My son looked absolutely defeated and broken while Briella was in the passenger seat, waving her arms and screaming in a desperate and hopeless way. I turned the deadbolt and locked the door, feeling like I had just won the most important battle of my life to protect my own dignity. I was no longer afraid of her lies or her threats, because I knew the truth was finally standing on my side. I went into the kitchen and made myself a hot cup of herbal tea, sitting down in the quiet to prepare for the final step of this journey. I knew that I had to take this all the way to a courtroom to make sure this abuse would be stopped permanently, and that no one would ever be able to question my sanity again. Everything was finally out in the open and the masks had all fallen away. Briella had thrown her most cruel and heartless punch, and I was still standing taller than ever before. I was done playing defense, and I was done being the victim of her greed. Attorney Miller and I spent the rest of the evening getting the final paperwork ready for a formal lawsuit that would end this nightmare once and for all. That upcoming court date was going to be the place where her lies and her hunger for my legacy would finally meet the justice they deserved. My dear sisters, have you ever felt like someone was trying to take away your right to choose for yourself just because of the years on your birth certificate? We have to remember that our wisdom and our life experiences are treasures that no one has the right to steal from us. If you believe that we always have the right to be the masters of our own lives, please leave a comment saying autonomy below, so we can keep lifting each other up. Are you all staying strong and peaceful today in your own homes? This morning, the ring chime on my phone signaled that a package had arrived in the mailbox. It was the official lawsuit and the summons for the court date. Holding that thick stack of papers felt heavy, but it was the weight of the truth in my hands. Florida has been dealing with some unusual cold snaps lately, and the chill in the air reminds me of how fragile we can feel when the people we love start acting like strangers. I sat down on my new sofa from Pottery Barn and took a long, deep breath to find my center in the middle of this lingering storm. I am no longer that same woman who was shaking like a leaf at that wedding, because every page in my hand is a steady step toward getting back the respect and the peace I deserve. Briella's lawyers sent over a settlement offer at the very last minute. They wanted me to drop the entire lawsuit, And in exchange, they promised they would leave me alone as long as I provided them with a significant amount of money to help with their new startup business venture. My lawyer, Miss Miller, looked at me through the computer screen with such a steady and determined gaze. We had everything prepared, from the bank statements showing exactly where Briella had moved my money to the recordings of the way she spoke to me in front of all our friends. Miss Miller told me I did not have to compromise with someone who had been so consistently dishonest, and I knew in my soul she was right. Refusing that offer was not about wanting to be difficult or seeking a confrontation, but about finally drawing a firm line in the sand for my own dignity and my future. I spent the better part of the afternoon going over every single piece of evidence one last time with Miss Miller to make sure we were ready. We found even more holes in Briella's story, where she claimed she was spending my hard-earned money on essential family needs, when the actual receipts were for very expensive designer makeup and luxury skin creams she bought for herself. Every little detail was organized perfectly, and that heavy anxiety I felt at the very beginning of this journey was gone and replaced by a feeling of total control. I felt like I was back in my professional element, doing the most important appraisal of my life, where every fake thing was being stripped away until only the truth was left standing in the bright light of day. Before I finished my day, I got a short call from Russell, and his voice sounded so raspy and tired, like he was finally having a hard time living with the truth I had put right in front of him. I did not yell at him or lose my temper, because I just told him gently that justice was going to help both of us see things clearly for what they really are once and for all. The silence in my house does not feel like loneliness anymore, but feels like the quiet and steady peace you get right before a major decision. I am ready to walk into that courtroom, not as a victim who has been pushed aside, but as a woman who has found her own power and her own voice again after being silent for way too long. Everything is ready and the papers are all signed and filed. Tonight, I am going to sleep a deep and restful sleep, so I have all my energy for the morning. The bright lights of the courtroom are going to replace those fake camera flashes from the wedding that felt so cold. I know I am not walking into that building by myself, because the truth and all my real allies are standing right behind me, ready to see this through to the very end. The courtroom was quiet in a way that made my skin crawl with a cold kind of dread. I sat there at the wooden table, and I could feel the warmth from Mrs. Harris's hand as she reached forward from the front row of the gallery to give my shoulder a quick squeeze. Briella walked in through those heavy double doors with a fake kind of confidence that you only see in people who are used to lying to themselves. She was wearing a sharp suit and a smile that did not reach her eyes, but I noticed she could not keep her gaze on me for more than a second before she looked away. The proceedings began with her taking the stand and spinning a web of lies that actually made my head spin. She tried to paint a picture of me as a frail and forgetful old woman who was constantly losing her way and needed their intervention just to survive. She talked about my finances like I was a child who did not understand the value of $1. Every single lie she told felt like she was adding another heavy stone to the wall she had built between us. But I just sat there in silence and waited for the truth to finally speak for itself. Attorney Miller did not waste a single second when it was her turn to cross-examine. She stood up with a grace and a sharpness that reminded me of the powerful women in my own family who never let a lie go unchallenged. She did not raise her voice, but she moved with a methodical pace as she brought out those enlarged bank statements that we had worked so hard to organize. She walked right up to Briella and asked her to explain why the money I had specifically set aside for vital home repairs was used instead to pay a massive deposit on a luxury yacht cruise for two. Briella started to stutter, and I watched the color drain from her face as she looked around the room for some kind of escape. Her face turned a deep shade of red as she realized she had been backed into a corner she could not talk her way out of. Attorney Miller's Words were as sharp as a surgeon's knife as she began to peel back every single layer of the financial scheme Briella had been running for months. The real turning point came when Ms. Miller brought out the secret weapon that I had found hidden away in that spare room. It was that manila folder containing the handwritten notes and the emails to the real estate brokers. When the court clerk held up those documents showing that Briella had been getting my house appraised before Russell had even proposed, it felt like the air was sucked right out of the room. I could hear people in the gallery whispering to one another, and the social worker I had met with earlier leaned forward in her seat with a look of pure shock. Russell was sitting right there in the front row, and he just put his head in his hands like he was finally seeing the ugly truth of the woman he was about to marry. The deception was so naked and so clear that there was no way anyone in that room could deny what had really been going on. When it was finally my turn to stand up and tell my story, I did not feel the anger I thought I would. Instead, I felt a deep sense of calm because I knew I was speaking for myself and for my husband, who was not there to defend me. I did not talk about hating them or wanting revenge, but I spoke about the love and the decades of sacrifice I had poured into my son and my home. I told the judge about my husband's Omega watch and how those sacred memories had been treated like cheap merchandise to be sold for a vacation. My voice stayed steady and clear as I looked the judge in the eye and told him that I was not asking for anything extra, but I was simply demanding the respect and the right to live in peace in the house I had earned with my own sweat. I could see the judge looking at me with a deep kind of empathy, and for the first time in this entire nightmare, I felt like I was actually being seen for who I really am. The judge sat back for a moment, and then he picked up his gavel with a look of absolute sternness. When he started to read his verdict, he did not hold anything back. He completely rejected every single request for guardianship that Briella had filed, and he ruled that I was a woman of perfectly sound mind and capable of handling my own affairs. He went even further and ordered Briella to return every single penny she had taken from my accounts, and he issued a formal reprimand for her predatory behavior toward a senior citizen. I felt a massive surge of satisfaction and joy, but it was quickly followed by a feeling of relief so powerful that I thought I might actually float right out of my chair. The dark storm that had been hanging over my life for months finally broke, and it felt like the sun was shining down on me for the very first time. Briella practically ran out of that courtroom with her face pale and her eyes full of a bitter defeat that she could not hide. Russell did not follow her right away because he stayed behind and looked at me with a look of such deep regret and shame that it almost broke my heart. I did not say anything to him because there were no words left to speak, but I gave him a gentle nod as he finally turned to walk away. I knew the biggest punishment for her was not just losing the money or the house, but having her true character exposed for everyone to see. I walked out of that courthouse and stood on the steps breathing in the humid Florida air like it was the sweetest thing I had ever tasted. It felt like I had finally taken off a lead coat that I had been forced to wear for years, and my body felt light and free. Justice had finally been served. But more than that, I had successfully protected the dignity of my name and the honor of my late husband. I turned and gave Attorney Miller a long hug, and I thanked my friends for standing by me when things were at their darkest. That long battle was finally over, and I realized that I was not just going back to my old life because I was starting a completely new one on my own terms. I was no longer the invisible woman they tried to make me out to be, because I was Madison Mack, and I was stronger than I ever realized. Everything had been settled in that courtroom, and the legal ties were finally cut for good. But as I walked toward my car, I realized that my journey of rediscovering myself was just getting started. I understood that for me to really have a fresh start, I needed to make some even bigger changes to my life and where I was headed. A whole new beginning was waiting for me just over the horizon, and I was ready to greet it with open arms. A few months after the court case was over, I decided to sell that old house because it just held too many heavy memories of a life that did not fit me anymore. I moved into a sun-drenched condo right by the water, where I can hear the waves from my balcony. I spend my days tending to a little patch of garden and getting lost in my Kindle Paperwhite without anyone telling me what to do or how to feel. I even started taking those gentle yoga classes at the community center, which has done wonders for my spirit. Russell is finally learning how to be a man on his own, and we are slowly finding our way back to each other based on real respect, instead of him just leaning on my bank account. I realized that at 68 years old, my life is not just some countdown to the end, because it is a whole new journey to find the passions I gave up a long time ago. My dear sisters, the most important thing I have learned through all of this is that our value does not come from how much we sacrifice for everyone else, but from how much we actually love and honor ourselves. Do not ever let someone use your age as an excuse to ignore your wisdom or quiet your voice. You have to be brave enough to draw those lines in the sand and ask for help when the weight gets too heavy. We have given so much of ourselves over the years, and we truly deserve to have a life that is full of peace and joy. To my resilient friends out there, please remember that you are the living legacy of our people and our families. Do not ever be afraid of those who try to abuse your kindness, because the truth and a righteous heart have a power that no one can ever take away from you. I want you to stay strong and keep looking forward to the good things coming your way. My story might be coming to a close for now, but your own story of freedom and finding yourself can begin this very minute. Thank you for sharing this time with me. It means so much to have you here. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and share it with a sister who needs to hear it. We are never alone when we stand together. Stay strong, keep your light shining, and stay blessed until next time.